So I'm gonna launch right in. I'm just gonna talk through some kind of basic research that we've done for the first 5 minutes before we open up to conversation, because I think that'll help ground us a little bit in kind of the way we approach voice and the way we think about AI and design. One of the reasons, like, I'm sure you all are like sick to death about hearing about voice in the news. Like, it's everyone's talking about it. Everyone's talking about Alexa. Everyone's talking about AI. The reason we care fundamentally is that this technology is not free, but an astonishing number of people are actually paying to bring it into their homes. It's a very complex piece of hardware and software, but 54 million people are estimated to have some form of standalone smart speaker in their homes in the United States. That's not even included the voice assistants that are embedded on our phones, which is astronomical. Like, this kind of hardware has grown faster than any other digital hardware, in the modern computing era. Faster than smartphones, faster than laptops. It is astonishing given how imperfect the technology is. And of the people that are using it, I think what's really interesting is they are using it every day. They might not be using it for a variety of things, but they are using it every day. They are learning the behavior of voice, and they are willing to give voice a chance and a role within, kind of prime real estate in their living rooms, and their kitchens, and their bedrooms. And the thing we want to talk about here is, like, what does that mean in other contexts, right? Like, so many people are focused on the home. I think this audience here, we're less focused on the home and more about, the employment use case, the work use case, the event use case. But we're seeing really similar trends, right? Like Amazon has launched an Alexa skill set specifically for employers that is just starting to develop. But fundamentally, I think what's really important is that this is an out loud experience. This is not a one-way experience. It's two-way. It's you saying something, and then the machine is actually saying something back. So in a sense, you are creating a relationship. This is really, really interesting, right? When you think about it in the workplace, in your conference room, these kind of dull, lifeless spaces, you are actually bringing a touch of humanity into them if you use voice experience correctly. And in order to do it well, I think these are the kind of rules we use when we're designing a voice experience. Like, these are the questions we need to answer before we'd ever embark on actually creating something. The first thing is, what user need will the voice UI, user interface, satisfy? What that means is, like, I think it's very easy to get in this realm of innovating for innovating's sake. But if we're actually concerned about people actually using this technology and it actually impacting their days for the better, we need to think really hard about, like, what are people actually doing? What are their behaviors? What are the pain points they have? And, like, what are the problems we can actually solve uniquely with voice versus what are things that people will always do faster with other interfaces. That's maybe an area we don't need to mess with voice, but what are things voice can actually help with? And I think that's what's really important to think about. What is your voice? And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But as a brand, what does voice do for you? As I mentioned earlier, it kind of humanizes the experience. It humanizes the relationship. But in order to have that human relationship, you have to figure out what kind of human you sound like. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then finally, what is the desired relationship to the user? So one thing that's coming back into the design universe here, which is really, really fascinating, because this is really old. This is Carl Jung's personality archetypes, sort of determining, like, from a human-to-human relationship, what are the different roles that you play? And out of these 12 archetypes, we find that to design a true personality, quote-unquote, it's normally a mix of any 3 of these archetypes. So for example, if you're thinking through a brand experience, and there we go. One manifestation of this is being a tutor, for example. If you want to have the relationship with your user where you are teaching them stuff and you want to feel like you are an authoritative voice, this comes up a lot with our kind of retail brands who are things like home improvement brands who want to be that authority on actually teaching you, like, how to install something or teaching you how to operate something. Then you kind of want to be more of a tutor, right? Like, Like, you don't want someone who's wishy-washy. You don't want someone who's kind of like being jokey and friendly. You want someone who's actually going to tell you what's what and give you the confidence that you're learning how to do something correctly. Another mode you might think about is the companion mode, where you're in that assistant mode where you're always with the user, you're listening, you're paying attention, and you're responding based on their context. That is kind of the more traditional kind of executive assistant role, someone who almost seems to know you, and that's where the AI really comes in, right? And I think one thing that's really important is like you can kind of vacillate between heavily AI-powered versions of voice or more scripted versions of voice. So for example, if you're the tutor, it's less about that two-way relationship necessarily, right? Like, yes, you have to be able to listen and respond if people have a question. Versus the companion mode, you have to always be listening and always be absorbing and always be learning. Think about your friendships, right? If you go out every Thursday night to the same happy hour and your friend asks you every single time, where are we going? That's pretty weird, right? Versus a real friend would actually know that and anticipate, oh, no, we're going to Joe's, right? And then you'll meet at Joe's and everything will be great, and you'll have your beer and your nachos ready. The last version is kind of the assistant role. This is a little bit less emotional, perhaps, in the companion role, but someone who's always there providing you functional utility, almost being able to anticipate your needs. And again, this is yet another manifestation of the personality. But what's really interesting is that despite voice being fairly new, this is not working. Next slide. Thank you. Despite voice being relatively new, we're already seeing this kind of manifestation of very age-old human stereotypes, right? Around, even the language of assistant, the language of tutor, the language of friend. It's very service-oriented, and some of that is starting to manifest in the actual voice experience, right? One of the things that I struggle with that I also find really interesting is whether we can push back against it is for both men and women, and I think you're unusual in this because you said you had a male voice, but men and women tend to prefer a female voice because it's less threatening, it's someone you can listen to in any context. Like, there have been a lot of tests around like kind of what constitutes a more irritating voice, and in general, like all the tests globally, this is not kind of US specific even. The preference is for female, with the exception of the United Kingdom, oddly enough, because there's more of a Jarvis stereotype because their history of kind of butlers and the servant class, so there's more acceptance of that male voice. But in many ways, we are kind of recreating those stereotypes in voice. So it is an open question as we're creating these experiences. Do we just go with it, or do we start to challenge it and really think about these different roles? So for example, a male voice may be better in the assistant role, but a female voice might be better in the tutor role. And that's just that's an opportunity to actually respond to those different contexts. But ultimately, though, those questions are important, but the first step to even begin to answer that question is to understand what your brand is, what your brand means, and then think about how to like make that thread throughout your voice experience. Because ultimately, yes, you are talking to a robot or you're talking to an AI, but this should be an extension of your brand. These are obviously pretty consumer-facing brands, but you can, when you start to think about what Google means in the meeting space, what Apple means in the meeting space, they start to mean different things, right? They start to have kind of design elements. They start to have different look and feel. And the next step is, how do they actually talk? Not to kind of boil this down a little bit, we all have actors who we love. We all have radio personalities who we love. And we can easily articulate what those differences are. Some are more playful, some are more authoritative. We kind of have to operate with that lens with voice as well. We're also seeing, certain tenets of what we constitute as a likable personality, a universally likable personality. First is the idea of being subordinate, which would sum up as, I'm not scary, I'm not going to challenge you. Even when I'm teaching you, I'm ultimately doing it for you. Second is conscientious, and that's that kind of ability to listen and respond and learn and always be your partner in housing your knowledge. Being empathetic, I think that one requires no explanation. Being good-humored is really important because I think just as humans, when we make mistakes, when we're uncomfortable, we make jokes, and that sets everyone at ease. Similarly, we're seeing in voice experience, you could have a 404 error state and say, sorry, I do not understand what that means, or you can make a joke out of it, a dad joke, a grandma joke, and we've found that people are actually more open to mistakes and willing to give you more of a chance if you actually make that interaction pleasant. And the last thing, this is what I think is really interesting, actually, this notion of, next slide, there we go, ethics, right? And I know we started out talking about ethics, and I want to land here. What does ethics actually mean? Ethics mean a lot of things in the pure AI world in terms of what data sets you're drawing from, what kind of stereotypes you're perpetuating. To me, the ethic that's most applicable to you guys here is making sure you're always designing for the user, right? It's really easy to start spinning in this world of we're designing for a space, we're designing for a company, we're designing for an experience. Ultimately, though, for voice to work, because it is a relationship, because it tends to be a one-to-one relationship, it has to be for the user. And with that, I think we'll open it up to discussion.
Yeah, I think one of the things you mentioned that's worth really thinking about is what's the role of the AI? Are we talking about here sort of general purpose, wide domain expertise, generalized artificial intelligence, or are we more likely in the near term to be encountering domain-specific AIs, right? So, which are obviously easier, low-hanging fruit. And I think if we think about the audience here today, we're likely not going to be, for the most part, authoring these artificial intelligence algorithms. We're not going to be developing these. But to realize as designers of experiences, say even in a conference room, right? If we were to take a super pragmatic example, if we were going to start to think about introducing voice into a workplace conference space or huddle room or anywhere where we're trying to collaborate with people, what's the role of that AI in that space? Is it there to help you set up the gear? Instead of pressing, I want to present from my PC, I can say that, sure. Or is it something that can notice that Tim is late to the meeting and reach out to him and say, hey, I see you're not really till 15 minutes into the agenda. I'll call you automatically, reduce his stress, let the people in the meeting take over. So I think it's really a question as designers of these functional workplace experiences, how do we start to understand this as a layer, as a toolkit in our UX toolkit, whether it's touch, whether it's voice, whether it's technical assistance from a human being, whatever.
I love the conference room example because I think that's one of the spaces which has become so cluttered by tech and by so many different versions of AV tech that we've almost lost the mission of the conference, which is actually to bring people together in a functional space where they can ideate, they can discuss, and hopefully even arrive at decisions. So that should be the number one goal. So how can voice or your suite of technology all work together to enable that? And then there's the next layer, right? To your point of is it about the setup? How do we help you get set up as quickly as possible? How do we deal with Joe, who's 10 minutes late, or Maria, who's at home working from home today, and making sure that everyone has the best experience that they possibly can? And I think where the AI can really help here is being able to say, instead of punishing Joe for being late, be able to wrap up, transcribe the first 5 minutes of the conversation, summarize it, and then give it to Joe so that when he joins, he can catch up quickly, silently, without interrupting the flow of the meeting. So I think there's a lot of really neat ways that AI can actually help kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I also think there's the question of whose AI is it, right?
Yeah.
So is it the room? Is it the personality of the room that's there to help you make the right, or are we all bringing our own agents, our own AI agents in some way with us around as we move through the spaces and through the world? And when do we want them to communicate so that they can deal with all the logistics and we can have the connection that we bothered to get up off of our butts and move into a space together so that we could be physically there and interact, and how do we get sort of the machines to do the stuff that they can do and that's actually valuable for them to do, and then declutter the humans to do what they're best at doing.
Yep. No, I think that's a really, really great point, and this is another kind of ethics-related area around the data privacy. Like, I think functionally for this to work, AI has to learn, right? It has to be listening and learning. Listening and learning requires that we consent to being listened to, and the data be reprocessed. So to me, the question is not, should we do it? The question is, who should the right partner be? Like, who do we trust to actually use that data in a responsible way? Who do we trust to not give away our data? Or do we make the choice that we want to kind of own the space entirely? We will be purely public with the training data so that everyone can benefit from creating, the best infrastructure for the experience.
And that's going to be a whole nother layer of the sort of what transparency do we expect or need from effectively the technology enabling
Right.
entities to really sort of say, okay, well, we want to adopt this, but I can't have a finance conversation about my publicly traded company
Yep.
in a room where you're listening and where you're collecting data that I can't be very explicit about how it is and is not to be used. So, the ethics part of this is actually, you could look at it through so many different lenses, right? One is the slippery slope of every time we disintegrate part of our interface to the machine, whether it's all the other ways that we're doing it as well, but when we disintegrate that interface, we start to personalize, and we as humans want to anthropomorphize, one too many syllables in there, the experience, and so we tend to do this really easily with voice. You were saying there's research to that effect, that just like we just tend to go into this very trusting mode, and that's not necessarily the appropriate posture to take.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to that point, that well-designed experience where you actually are using the nuances of human speech. You are actually using humor to disarm mistakes. You are actually using humor to disarm sort of the creepier aspects of it. People are going to be more accepting of it just because we are fundamentally a species that relies on voice and speech. Two of our senses are devoted to processing that, so it is easier for us to handle versus any other interface with the computer, which is you are actually learning a language, right? Like going back to DOS, you are literally learning a language versus even now on iPads, when you have touchscreen, we're kind of getting closer, but it still requires knowing that symbolism that the manufacturer uses to operate versus voice, in theory, is purely intuitive.
Purely intuitive, but it's still an idiom that we're going to have to develop. And what's going to be interesting and maybe funny is going to be to see how we start to communicate in specific ways when we're communicating to a voice AI, and what sort of idiomatic stuff is going to happen culturally that's then going to come into another domain. We had this conversation a little bit earlier about I made fun of somebody the other day in the office because they sat down to Google something and they were typing, but they said, "Okay, Google."
Yeah.
And or people who now say LOL in verbal communication, in verbal conversation, right? So it's going to be interesting to see what kind of little idioms come out. But if I'm in a room and I'm with an AI and three other people, first of all, what's the hierarchy of who's allowed to talk to it? Who's allowed to engage with it?
How do you talk to it?
How do you talk to it? How do you summon it into the conversation in a way that doesn't make you feel like it was there the whole time? And I think that some of that goes to, again, back to the designing a user experience. For the people in this space that have made an effort to put themselves in this space, how do you then lower the barrier to having a meaningful interaction? And certainly AI and voice AI can be a factor in that. if we can figure out what the role is that we want in it. And I think from a very practical standpoint, if you're a systems integrator who's spent the last 20 years perfecting, and having been in a lot of conference rooms, we'll define perfection some other time, but perfecting the user interface of a touch screen, a Crestron AMX, whatever Tron interface in a conference room, and now you're trying to think of, okay, how am I going to add voice into that user experience? You're still going to be asking yourself the same thing. Am I asking the human to say, select input 1 on the TV, select the box on the in the credenza, select the input on the thing, turn the voice up, turn the voice down, oh, we're making a phone call, I should unmute the microphone. Or are we going to say, I need to make a conference call with Japan. And yes, I'm going to have a screen share. And no, I don't need video. Because that's the kind of thing where we really should be thinking about the machine as doing what was it I said earlier? Do what I want, not what I said, right? We shouldn't be burdening the humans to be the macro executors.
Yeah, and I think that's ultimately like where the design community is crystallizing around voice, which I think is very positive, and I hope it stays this way, is that kind of mantra of like always be helpful, like always think about what behaviors you want to enable versus, serving adverse outcomes.
Yep. Yeah. I'm not sure if they're playing us off. I don't know what time it is.
Are they playing us off?
How are we doing on time? Somebody of the Infocom time. There you go.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.